A boy gives his blanket to a shivering janitor, but the next day, his mom receives a call that changes their lives forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Ethan Miller clutched his father's blanket to his chest as he stared through the frosted window of Lincoln Elementary. Outside, Mr. Jenkins struggled against the biting wind, his bony fingers barely able to grip the broom as he attempted to clear the school entrance of accumulating snow. Ethan pressed his palm against the cold glass, feeling the icy barrier between the heated building and the brutal winter storm raging outside. The school's outdoor thermometer read 15 degrees, the worst blizzard their small town had seen in decades. Red warning digits flashed ominously against the whiteness beyond. Ethan's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out with one hand, the other still gripping the blue plaid blanket that smelled faintly of his father's aftershave, even 8 months after the accident. A text from Mom. "Covering another double shift. We'll be late picking you up. Stay inside. Love you." Ethan sighed. Third double shift this week. Since Dad died, Mom had been working constantly at the hospital, but they were still drowning in medical bills. Last night, he'd heard her crying at the kitchen table, sorting through envelopes marked "Final Notice" and "Past Due." He ran his fingers over the soft, worn fabric of the blanket. Dad had wrapped himself in it the morning of the accident, complaining about the heating system failing again. "This old thing's gotten me through worse," he'd said with a wink, sipping his coffee on the couch. 3 hours later, the police were at their door. A violent gust of wind rattled the window, pulling Ethan back to the present. Mr. Jenkins stumbled, nearly falling on the ice. The old man regained his balance and continued sweeping, his thin jacket flapping uselessly against the elements. Ethan noticed the janitor wasn't wearing proper gloves, just some old rags wrapped around his fingers, now stiff and red with cold. Everyone else had left hours ago when the early dismissal was announced. Even Ms. Reynolds, the principal, had hurried out after ensuring Ethan had a safe place to wait. "Your mother's coming, right?" she'd asked, already putting on her heavy coat. Ethan had nodded, not mentioning that coming might mean hours from now. Mr. Jenkins coughed violently, the sound carrying even through the thick glass. Ethan pressed his face closer to the window. The old man's lips looked blue. Why was he still out there when everyone else had gone home? Ethan gathered his courage and pushed open the heavy front door, immediately hit by a wall of frigid air that stole his breath. "Mr. Jenkins," he called, stepping carefully onto the partially cleared steps. "You should come inside. It's too cold." The janitor turned, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Just finishing up," he wheezed, another cough racking his thin frame. "Principal wants entrance clear for morning." "But the storm's getting worse," Ethan protested, clutching his father's blanket tighter as the wind tried to tear it from his grasp. "The weather app says it won't stop until tomorrow afternoon." Up close, Ethan could see how badly Mr. Jenkins was shivering. His knuckles were raw and cracked where the makeshift hand coverings had slipped. His ancient work boots had splits along the sides where snow was clearly getting in. "Got no choice, son," the janitor said, leaning on his broom for support. "Need this job." Ethan looked down at the blanket in his arms. Dad had used it every winter for as long as he could remember. It was the last thing his father had touched before leaving for work that final day. Mom had cried when Ethan asked if he could take it to school today, the anniversary of 8 months since the accident. But she'd understood. "It makes you feel close to him," she'd said, kissing his forehead. "I get it." Now, watching Mr. Jenkins fight to stay upright in the punishing cold, something shifted inside Ethan's chest. "Here," he said suddenly, extending the blanket toward the old man. His voice cracked with emotion. "Take it. You need it more than I do." Mr. Jenkins stared at the offering, then at Ethan's face. "I can't take that, son. Looks important to you." "It was my dad's," Ethan admitted, his eyes burning with unshed tears. "But he would have wanted you to have it right now. Please." For a moment, the only sound was the howling wind. Then slowly, with trembling hands, Mr. Jenkins reached for the blanket. "You're sure?" he asked, his eyes, watery from the wind or perhaps something else, searching Ethan's face. Ethan nodded, unable to speak as the blanket left his possession. A physical ache bloomed in his chest as he watched Mr. Jenkins carefully wrap the plaid fabric around his shoulders. "Thank you," the old man said, his voice thick. "I won't forget this." The transformation was immediate. Mr. Jenkins stood a little straighter, his shivering less violent. He looked at Ethan with an expression the boy couldn't quite name, something between gratitude and profound respect. "You should get back inside now," Mr. Jenkins said, suddenly sounding more authoritative. "I'll finish up quick and lock up after you leave." Ethan nodded and retreated into the school. From the window, he watched as Mr. Jenkins worked with renewed energy, the blue plaid blanket secured around his thin shoulders. The walk home was brutal. Ethan had forgotten how inadequate his jacket was without the extra layer of his father's blanket. The wind cut through the thin material like it wasn't even there, and snow found its way down his collar and into his boots. By the time he reached their apartment building, his teeth were chattering uncontrollably, and he couldn't feel his toes. The apartment was empty and cold. Mom had turned the thermostat down to save on heating bills. Ethan cranked it up temporarily, then set about making dinner. Instant ramen, the only thing he really knew how to cook. As he waited for the water to boil, he sent a text to his mother. "Home safe, made dinner, love you." Her reply came almost an hour later. "Emergency at hospital. Might be all night. Leftover chicken in fridge. Lock the doors. Love you more." Ethan ate alone at the kitchen table, surrounded by the silence of an empty home. After washing his dish, he turned the thermostat back down and headed to bed, piling every available blanket on top of himself. None of them smelled like Dad. Despite the physical cold, something warm had settled in Ethan's chest, a feeling he couldn't quite identify. He'd given away something precious, something irreplaceable, and yet it felt right. Dad would have approved. That thought was comforting enough that he eventually drifted off to sleep. In his dreams, Dad was there, sitting at the edge of his bed, smiling that crooked smile that always meant he was proud. "You did good today, kiddo," Dream Dad said, ruffling Ethan's hair. "I'm proud of you, son." Ethan reached out in his sleep, trying to hold on to the image, but it faded like mist. Still, the warm feeling remained. Morning brought knee-deep snow and biting winds that howled around the apartment building. School would surely be canceled, but Ethan hadn't received any notification. With no other option, he bundled up in his inadequate jacket and set out. The walk was even worse than yesterday. Without the blanket as an extra layer, the cold seemed to reach straight into his bones. By the time the school building came into view, Ethan could barely feel his limbs. Something was wrong. Despite the early hour and terrible weather, a crowd had gathered in the schoolyard. Teachers huddled in groups, their expressions grave. Principal Reynolds stood on the front steps, her voice carrying across the white expanse as she addressed the assembled staff. Ethan pushed through the snow toward his classroom teacher, Ms. Abernathy, who stood slightly apart from the others, her face pale. "What's happening?" he asked, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Ms. Abernathy turned, startled. "Ethan, I didn't expect any students to make it in today. Didn't you get the cancellation alert?" Ethan shook his head, suddenly aware of his phone's battery dying overnight. "What's going on? Why is everyone here?" Ms. Abernathy's expression softened with concern. "It's Mr. Jenkins. He collapsed at home last night and was rushed to the hospital. Principal Reynolds just told us." The warm feeling in Ethan's chest instantly transformed into a block of ice heavier than any snowdrift. Is he okay? We don't know much yet, Miss Abernathy said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. They think it might have been hypothermia and possibly a heart condition. My blanket wasn't enough, Ethan murmured, the guilt crushing. I shouldn't have let him keep working in the cold. Miss Abernathy frowned, leaning closer. What blanket, Ethan? Before he could respond, his phone vibrated in his pocket, somehow finding enough battery for one last notification. Ethan pulled it out with trembling fingers, read the message, and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. It was from his mother. Come to the hospital now. Family emergency. Ethan stood frozen in the schoolyard, staring at Principal Reynolds while the announcement about Mr. Jenkins' collapse echoed in his ears. His mind immediately connected the dots. The blanket hadn't been enough to protect the old man from the brutal cold. My fault, he whispered, the words forming a small cloud in the freezing air. My blanket wasn't enough. Miss Abernathy leaned closer, her brow furrowed in concern. What blanket, Ethan? What are you talking about? Before he could answer, Ethan felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. With trembling fingers, he pulled it out, the screen lighting up with his mother's urgent message. Come to the hospital now. Family emergency. His heart pounded against his ribs. What did this mean? Had someone discovered what happened with the blanket? Had Mr. Jenkins died because of his inadequate help? Had his mother somehow lost her job because of a connection to all this? I have to go, Ethan stammered, backing away from Ms. Abernathy. My mom needs me at the hospital. The hospital? Wait, Ethan, let me drive you, she called after him. But he was already running, slipping and sliding through the snow-covered yard toward the street. The journey to Mercy General felt endless. The buses were running on delayed schedules due to the storm, and Ethan spent 20 agonizing minutes at the stop, shivering violently without his father's blanket. When the bus finally arrived, it crawled through the snow-clogged streets at a painful pace. Ethan pressed his forehead against the cold window, watching his breath fog the glass. His mind raced with terrible possibilities. Had the old janitor died from exposure despite the blanket? Would they blame him for not calling an ambulance instead? Would his mother lose her nursing job because of some connection to all this? By the time he reached the hospital, his anxiety had transformed into a physical ache. He burst through the automatic doors, the antiseptic smell hitting him immediately. The familiar sterile corridors where his mother worked now seemed alien and threatening. He navigated the maze of hallways, heading toward the emergency department where his mother usually worked. The hospital buzzed with activity. Doctors rushing past with clipboards, nurses pushing medication carts, family members sitting anxiously in waiting areas. Mom? Ethan called, scanning the nursing station for Jessica's familiar face. He found her in a quiet corridor away from the main activity. She was leaning against the wall, still in her rumpled nursing scrubs after what must have been a 16-hour shift. Her face was pale, with clear signs of recent tears. Mom, what happened? Ethan asked breathlessly, his chest tight with fear. Jessica looked up, her exhaustion evident in the dark circles under her eyes. Ethan, honey, thank you for coming so quickly. She pulled him into a tight hug. Is it about Mr. Jenkins? He asked, his voice muffled against her scrubs. I heard he collapsed. Is it my fault? Did the blanket not help enough? Jessica pulled back, holding him at arm's length with a confused expression. Mr. Jenkins? You mean Mr. Thompson? He had a heart attack early this morning. He's been asking for you. Insisted, actually. Thompson? But his name is Jenkins, Ethan protested, confusion replacing fear. He's the school janitor. Jessica's frown deepened. Apparently not. His name is William Thompson. He's a retired attorney. She hesitated, then added, and he knew your father. Before Ethan could process this bewildering information, a tall man in an expensive suit approached them, carrying a leather portfolio. His shoes squeaked against the polished hospital floor. "Mrs. Miller, I'm Gregory Walsh, Mr. Thompson's assistant. We need to discuss some urgent matters." His voice was polished, professional, with an undertone of impatience. Jessica straightened, her protective instincts visibly kicking in. "My son just arrived. We need a moment." Walsh checked his gold wristwatch. "Of course. But Mr. Thompson is insistent about speaking with the boy as soon as possible. His condition is uncertain." Jessica nodded stiffly and turned back to Ethan. "Mr. Thompson, the man you know as Mr. Jenkins, is in room 342. He wants to talk to you, but you don't have to if you don't want to." "I want to," Ethan said quickly. "I need to know if he's okay, if my blanket helped at all." His mother's puzzled expression deepened, but she simply nodded and led him toward the elevator, with Walsh following at a respectful distance. In room 342, the man Ethan knew as Mr. Jenkins looked frail against the white hospital sheets. Monitors beeped steadily beside the bed, and an IV drip fed into his arm. Despite the gravity of the situation, Ethan immediately noticed his father's blue plaid blanket, carefully folded on the chair near the bed. "My boy," the old man whispered, his voice hoarse. His eyes lit up when he saw Ethan. "You came." Ethan approached the bed cautiously. "Mr. Jenkins, or Mr. Thompson?" The old man smiled weakly. "William Thompson is my real name. Jenkins was just what I went by at the school." He gestured toward the blanket. "Your gesture, it saved my life. The doctors say without that blanket, I would have died of hypothermia before I could get help." Ethan wanted to smile at this news, but confusion held him back. None of this made sense. Why would a wealthy attorney work as a school janitor? And how did he know Ethan's father? "What's going on?" Jessica asked, her exhaustion giving way to suspicion as she moved protectively closer to her son. William coughed painfully before explaining. "After my son died 10 years ago, I started volunteering. It helps fill the void. I found that janitorial work allowed me to observe people honestly, see their true character." He took a labored breath before continuing. "As an attorney, I was the executor of Richard Collins' will. He was your husband's distant cousin." "I never heard of any cousin," Jessica said flatly. "Neither did your husband," William confirmed. "Richard was the black sheep of the family, cut off from most relatives. He made his fortune in pharmaceuticals and died 2 months ago." William's eyes moved back to Ethan. "He left everything to David Miller's family. I was trying to locate you when—" His eyes welled with tears, "when this young man showed me the true meaning of generosity." Gregory Walsh cleared his throat and stepped forward. "The inheritance is substantial, Mrs. Miller. Enough to clear your medical debts and secure the boy's future." Jessica's expression hardened. "This sounds convenient." "I understand your skepticism," William said, "but I've been searching for you for weeks. Your husband's death was not well publicized, and you've moved twice since then." "How do you know that?" Jessica demanded. "It's my job to know," William replied simply. "Richard's will was specific. His estate goes to his cousin's family. When I discovered David had passed, I had to find his widow and son." "And you just happened to get a job at my son's school? As a janitor?" Jessica's voice dripped with disbelief. William exchanged a glance with his assistant before replying, "I've found that the best way to evaluate character is to observe people when they think no one important is watching. A janitor is invisible to most people." His eyes returned to Ethan. "But not to your son." Ethan stared at the blanket on the chair, trying to process everything. "Is that why you were working without proper clothes? To test me?" William shook his head emphatically, triggering another coughing fit. When he recovered, he said, "No, child. That was my own foolishness. I underestimated the storm's severity, and my pride kept me from admitting I was ill-prepared. Your kindness was completely unexpected and deeply humbling." Gregory Walsh interrupted again. "We should discuss the inheritance details. There are papers that need signing." Jessica held up her hand. "Not now. I need time to verify all of this." She turned to Ethan. "We should go home and let Mr. Thompson rest." Ethan nodded reluctantly, his eyes still on the old man in the bed. Can I visit again?" William smiled warmly. "I'd like that very much." As they prepared to leave, William called out, "Take the blanket, Ethan. It belongs with you." Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "Keep it until you're better. I think it helps." The drive home was silent, Jessica's knuckles white on the steering wheel. As they approached their apartment building, Ethan noticed a black car parked across the street. 2 men in suits sat inside, watching. "Mom," he said quietly, pointing toward the vehicle. Jessica's jaw tightened as she pulled into their parking spot. She squeezed Ethan's shoulder. "Stay close to me." Inside their apartment, Jessica immediately began researching William Thompson on her laptop, while Ethan made hot chocolate for them both. "I don't trust this," she whispered, scanning through page after page of legal directories. "It's too convenient." "But what if it's true?" Ethan asked, setting a steaming mug beside her. "What if we really do have a rich relative who left us money?" "Rich people don't just give away fortunes to distant relatives they've never met," Jessica replied, her voice hard with the wisdom of someone who had learned life's harsh lessons. "And rich attorneys don't work as school janitors." Before Ethan could respond, the phone rang. Jessica answered, her expression shifting from suspicion to confusion and then to alarm. "Yes, this is she said, her voice guarded. "I see. Yes, he's here with me now." A pause. "Tomorrow morning? That seems very sudden." Another pause. "I understand. We'll be there." She hung up and turned to Ethan, her face ashen. "That was Mrs. Rodriguez, the school social worker. Someone reported child neglect. A boy without adequate winter clothing during the worst blizzard in decades." While Jessica turned back to her computer, frantically researching with renewed urgency, Ethan walked to the window and peered through the curtains. The black car remained parked across the street, its occupants now talking on phones and taking photographs of their apartment building. The social worker's office felt like a prison to Ethan. Sitting on a hard plastic chair designed for adults, his feet barely touched the floor as he listened to his mother try to explain their financial situation. The woman across the desk, Ms. Patel according to her nameplate, took notes with an impassive expression, her pen scratching against the notepad like a judge recording a sentence. "Mrs. Miller, we understand the difficulties of single parenthood," Ms. Patel said, her voice professional but cold. "However, the report indicates your son gave away his only adequate winter garment to a stranger. This suggests he's not receiving appropriate guidance." "It was my choice," Ethan interjected, his voice stronger than he expected. "My mom didn't even know about it until yesterday." Ms. Patel shifted her gaze to him, her expression unchanged. "That's precisely the problem, Ethan. Supervision is about preventing poor decisions before they happen. Your mother cannot guide you if she isn't present." Jessica leaned forward, dark circles prominent under her eyes after another sleepless night. "I work hospital shifts to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. The school was supposed to be closed yesterday. Ethan is usually with our neighbor, Mrs. Gonzalez, when I'm working. Mrs. Gonzalez, who is 83 and was hospitalized herself last week for pneumonia." Ms. Patel consulted her notes. "We've done our homework, Mrs. Miller." Jessica's face flushed. "That was temporary. We have arrangements." The door opened without a knock, and Gregory Walsh stepped in, impeccably dressed as before. Ms. Patel's demeanor instantly changed, straightening in her chair. "Mr. Walsh, this is a confidential meeting." "Forgive the intrusion," Walsh replied smoothly, closing the door behind him. "I'm here as a character witness for the Miller family. May I?" He gestured to an empty chair. Ms. Patel hesitated, then nodded. Walsh sat beside Jessica, placing his leather portfolio on the desk. "The transfer of funds will be completed within 3 days," he explained, pulling out several official-looking documents. "However, there are some complications. The will specifies that the funds must be managed by a financial guardian until Ethan turns 21. "What guardian?" Jessica asked, her suspicion growing visibly. "William Thompson." Jessica's face hardened. "The man who conveniently appeared at my son's school posing as a janitor? This keeps getting more suspicious." Walsh smiled thinly. "Mr. Thompson has an impeccable reputation in legal circles. His methods may be unconventional, but his integrity is beyond question." Before Jessica could respond, her phone rang. She glanced at the screen, frowning. "It's the hospital. I need to take this." Stepping into the hallway, Jessica answered. Ethan could see her through the glass partition, her expression shifting from annoyance to concern. When she returned, her face was pale. "William Thompson has suffered another heart attack. His condition is critical." Walsh stood immediately, gathering his papers. "Without his signature on the final documents, the inheritance will be locked in legal disputes for years." Ms. Patel cleared her throat. "Our matter isn't concluded, Mrs. Miller." "We'll continue this later," Jessica said firmly. "My son and I need to get to the hospital." "This situation only reinforces my concerns about supervision," Ms. Patel replied, but Jessica was already guiding Ethan toward the door. The drive to Mercy General was tense and silent. When they arrived, Jessica led Ethan through familiar corridors to William's room, only to find it empty. The bed was perfectly made, as if no one had ever occupied it. "Where's Mr. Thompson?" Jessica asked a nurse passing by. The woman glanced at the room number. 342? Let me check." She consulted a tablet. "That patient was transferred about an hour ago." "Transferred where?" Jessica demanded, her nursing authority coming through. The nurse's expression turned apologetic but firm. "I'm not authorized to disclose that information." "I'm a nurse here," Jessica pressed. "I'm aware, Mrs. Miller. The orders specifically state no information to hospital staff. Private transport, private orders." The nurse walked away, leaving them standing in the empty doorway. "This doesn't make sense," Jessica muttered, pulling out her phone to call the nursing supervisor. Gregory Walsh appeared at the end of the hallway, walking toward them with measured steps. "Mrs. Miller, a word, please." "Where did they take him?" Jessica demanded. "To a private facility with specialized cardiac care," Walsh replied smoothly. "Mr. Thompson has made arrangements for his treatment for years. His living will is quite specific." "And the inheritance paperwork?" Jessica asked suspiciously. Walsh's expression remained neutral. "We'll have to wait until he's stabilized. I've arranged temporary funds to help with your immediate needs." He extended an envelope. $5,000, a gesture of good faith. Jessica didn't take it. "Let's go, Ethan." The ride home was silent again, but Ethan could almost hear his mother's thoughts churning. When they reached their apartment building, the black car was gone, which somehow felt more ominous than comforting. Inside the apartment, Ethan immediately sensed something wrong. The furniture was in place, but subtle differences caught his attention. A drawer not fully closed, books on the shelf slightly rearranged. The fruit bowl centered too perfectly on the table. "Mom," he whispered, tugging her sleeve. "Someone's been here." Jessica scanned the living room, then moved quickly to the kitchen. She reached behind the loose baseboard where she kept emergency cash, the rent money, and pulled out an empty envelope. "It's gone," she said, her voice tight. "All of it." Ethan ran to his room. His belongings seemed undisturbed until he looked at his desk. The framed photo of his father, David, teaching Ethan how to fish when he was 7, was missing. He checked his dresser, then his bookshelf. Every photo containing his father had vanished. "Mom," he called, panic rising in his throat. "All Dad's pictures are gone." Jessica rushed in, her face ashen. She went to her bedroom and returned moments later. "Mine too. Every single one." They stood in shocked silence, the reality sinking in. Jessica finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a trap. They're using us for something." "But why?" Ethan asked. "What would anyone want from us?" Jessica shook her head. "I don't know, but we need to be careful." She grabbed her phone and dialed the police. 20 minutes later, an officer had taken their statement but seemed skeptical. No forced entry, nothing of significant value taken except cash. And photos? He flipped his notebook closed. "We'll file the report, but frankly, ma'am, this sounds more like a civil matter, maybe related to the inheritance you mentioned." After the officer left, Jessica paced the living room. "Tomorrow we're going to the bank to open a safety deposit box. Anything important goes in there, not here." "What about the social worker?" Ethan asked quietly. As if on cue, the phone rang. Jessica answered, her spine stiffening as she listened. "Yes, I understand. 8 a.m. tomorrow. We'll be prepared." She hung up, her expression grim. "Ms. Patel, surprise home visit tomorrow morning." They planned this, Ethan realized aloud. "They took our money so we couldn't pay rent." Jessica nodded slowly. "And they took Dad's photos to upset us, make us look unstable." She sat heavily on the couch. "We need to clean this place spotless tonight, and find your winter coat, the old one in storage." Ethan felt tears welling in his eyes. "We're going to lose everything, aren't we? Even each other." Jessica pulled him into a fierce hug. "Never. I will never let that happen." That night, after scrubbing the apartment to perfection, Jessica finally collapsed into exhausted sleep on the couch. Ethan, unable to rest, wandered to the living room and picked up his father's blanket. The one thing the intruders hadn't stolen, returned by William before his second heart attack. Holding it under the dim light of the side table lamp, Ethan examined the familiar blue plaid pattern. His fingers traced the worn edges, stopping when they encountered something unusual, a small pocket sewn into the border, nearly invisible against the pattern. Curious, he carefully explored the hidden compartment, his fingers closing around something small and solid. Pulling it out, he found a USB drive and a folded note. Heart racing, Ethan unfolded the paper and read the message written in careful, precise handwriting. "The truth about your father. Be careful who you trust." Morning arrived with harsh gray light filtering through the blinds. Ethan woke with a start, the USB drive clutched tightly in his palm where he'd fallen asleep holding it. He quickly tucked it into his pocket as he heard his mother moving around the kitchen. A bright yellow eviction notice was taped to their apartment door. Jessica stared at it, her face ashen, as Ethan emerged from his room. 48 hours to vacate," she read aloud, her voice hollow. "Or they put our belongings on the street." Ethan approached cautiously. "But they can't do that. We didn't even miss a payment yet." "According to this, we did." Jessica pointed to a clause on the notice. "Rent was due yesterday. The money they stole was for rent." She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Get ready for school. I'm going to call every legal aid office in the city." "What about the social worker visit?" Jessica checked her watch. "We have 2 hours. The apartment is clean. Just wear your old winter coat so she sees you have proper clothing." At school, Ethan moved through the morning in a daze. The halls buzzed with gossip about Mr. Jenkins's collapse, but none of his classmates knew the bizarre truth. During lunch break, when everyone else headed to the cafeteria, Ethan slipped into the computer lab. The room was empty. He chose the computer furthest from the door, partially hidden by a bookshelf. With trembling fingers, he inserted the USB drive. A password prompt appeared on screen. Ethan stared at it blankly. What would William Thompson use as a password? He tried Jenkins, incorrect. He tried William and Thompson, both incorrect. Thinking of his father, he typed David, incorrect again. A memory surfaced, his father teaching him about creating secure passwords. Use something meaningful, but not obvious, Dad had said. Something only you would connect to the situation. Ethan thought about the blanket, his father's blanket. With sudden certainty, he typed, blue-checked warmth. The drive unlocked. Dozens of files appeared, organized in folders with clinical names. Collins Pharma test results, internal memos, financial transactions, evidence backup. Ethan opened the first folder and found himself staring at chemical formulas and test results he couldn't understand. He moved to a folder labeled David Miller. Inside was a subfolder simply titled Truth. The files revealed a shocking reality. His father hadn't died in a car accident. David Miller had been a chemist at Biotech Formulations, a subsidiary company owned by Collins Enterprises, property of the distant cousin, Richard Collins. Documents showed that his father had discovered serious problems with a new medication the company was rushing to market. Formulas had been altered to reduce production costs, resulting in dangerous side effects that were being actively covered up. Email exchanges showed David's increasing concern and the company's dismissive responses. The final email was dated 3 days before his death. I cannot in good conscience remain silent. If these issues aren't addressed by Friday, I'll be taking my findings to the FDA and the press. There was no reply to that email. 3 days later, David Miller died when his car veered off the road and hit a tree. The police report indicated brake failure. Ethan's hands shook as he clicked on a video file titled, For Ethan and Jessica. The screen filled with the face of an elderly man he didn't recognize, clearly ill, recording himself in what looked like a home office. If you're watching this, Ethan, I'm probably dead. The man's voice was weak but determined. My name is William Thompson. I met your father briefly before his death. He came to me because I was one of the few attorneys not on Collins' payroll. William coughed violently before continuing. Your father entrusted me with evidence of criminal negligence and fraud at Collins Enterprises. Richard Collins left his fortune to your family out of guilt. He discovered the truth about your father's death only after terminal cancer had been diagnosed. The elderly man leaned closer to the camera. The men claiming to be my assistants are Collins executives trying to recover these files. Trust only the janitor who goes by Jenkins. He's my older brother, a former detective who agreed to help me find you. A noise in the hallway startled Ethan. He quickly copied the files to his school email account, wiped his browser history, and ejected the drive. Seconds later, Ms. Abernathy entered the lab. Ethan, what are you doing here alone? Research project, he lied smoothly, tucking the drive into his pocket. I'm finished now. Back home, Ethan found Jessica surrounded by papers, making frantic phone calls. She gave him a tired smile as she hung up. Any luck? He asked. She shook her head. Legal aid is backed up for weeks. I've called everyone. Mom, I need to show you something, Ethan said urgently, pulling out the USB drive. Before he could explain, a sharp knock interrupted them. Jessica glanced at the clock. The social worker was 30 minutes early. Not now, she whispered to Ethan. Hide that and remember our story. Ms. Patel wasn't alone. An older man with a police badge stood beside her, not in uniform, but his authority was unmistakable. However, instead of the accusatory visit they expected, they found the genuine Mr. Jenkins, now revealed as James Thompson, standing alongside them, looking completely recovered. He held an old police detective's badge in one hand. Mrs. Miller, Ms. Patel began formally. This is Detective James Thompson, retired. He has information relevant to our investigation. James Thompson, Jessica repeated, glancing between the man and Ethan with confusion. William's older brother, James explained. His voice was gruffer than William's, but carried the same thoughtful cadence. "I believe your son has found some information that belongs to me." Ethan pulled the USB drive from his pocket. "You're the real Mr. Jenkins, the ex-detective?" James nodded solemnly. "William recruited me to help find you after he became too ill to continue his investigation. When I saw how the Collins people were closing in, I decided to position myself where I could keep an eye on you." "Gregory Walsh and his associates are being arrested as we speak," Ms. Patel interjected. "Corporate murder, document fraud, breaking and entering. Detective Thompson brought compelling evidence to the police commissioner this morning." Jessica looked stunned. "Then the neglect investigation, a necessary cover to get us into your home without alerting Walsh's surveillance team," Ms. Patel explained. "I'm actually Agent Patel, FBI." Ethan stared at James. "But you really collapsed. You were in the hospital." "Mild hypothermia and exhaustion," James admitted. "Your blanket genuinely saved me that night. But it also gave Walsh's team the perfect opportunity to infiltrate the hospital staff and keep tabs on both of us." Agent Patel checked her watch. "There are federal agents waiting outside. We need to move you to a safe location until the arrests are complete." "Our apartment," Jessica began. "Is being watched," James finished. "The eviction notice was forged. Part of their attempt to destabilize your situation and make your son a candidate for emergency foster placement. They wanted leverage over you. And control of the inheritance," Jessica realized. "More importantly," James added grimly, "control of the evidence David collected." In a safe house across town, Ethan and Jessica watched news reports of the unfolding scandal. Several Collins Enterprises executives were shown being led into police headquarters in handcuffs. Gregory Walsh's face was pixelated, but his distinctive posture was recognizable. "Your father was a brave man," James told Ethan, sitting heavily in an armchair. "When he discovered what Collins was doing, adulterating medications to increase profits, he gathered evidence methodically. He suspected they might silence him. So he prepared," Ethan said quietly. James nodded. "He contacted William because of his reputation for incorruptibility. William had prosecuted Collins years earlier for similar violations, though on a smaller scale. When your father died, William promised to get the evidence to the proper authorities. Then William got sick," Jessica surmised. "Terminal cancer," James confirmed. "When Richard Collins was diagnosed with the same cancer, his conscience finally bothered him. He changed his will, leaving everything to your family as restitution. That's when William knew he had to find you, but by then he was too weak to do it himself." "So, you became Mr. Jenkins," Ethan said. "Someone had to protect you," James replied simply. "I just didn't expect it to work in reverse." Agent Patel entered with fresh coffee. "We've secured the apartment. You can return tomorrow, but I recommend finding new accommodations soon. The media will connect the dots eventually." "The inheritance?" Jessica asked cautiously. "Is genuine," Agent Patel confirmed. "Once the case against Collins Enterprises goes public, the courts will expedite your claim. Richard Collins left you approximately $12 million, plus controlling interest in his legitimate businesses." Jessica sat down hard. "That's impossible." "Your husband saved countless lives by exposing that fraud," James said quietly. "To Richard, it was a fair price." That night in the simple bedroom of the safe house, Ethan placed the USB drive on the nightstand. His father had prepared for a future he wouldn't see, protecting his family from beyond the grave. "Dad knew they might kill him," he said when Jessica came to say goodnight. "But he still did the right thing." "That was who he was," Jessica replied, sitting beside him on the bed. "Always willing to sacrifice for others." She smiled sadly. "Like father, like son." "Do you think we'll be okay now?" Ethan asked. "Better than okay," Jessica promised. "We'll make sure your father's courage wasn't wasted." As Jessica turned out the light, Ethan thought about the blanket. how a simple act of kindness had unraveled a conspiracy and revealed the truth. Somewhere in the city, the Collins executives were frantically trying to contain the damage, while federal agents combed through company records. "Mom," Ethan said in the darkness, "when all this is over, can we create a scholarship for kids who do the right thing even when it's hard?" Jessica's voice was thick with emotion. "Your father would have loved that idea." When the agents came to check on them an hour later, they found Jessica and Ethan sound asleep, the USB drive glowing faintly on the nightstand like a tiny beacon of truth. The agent on duty carefully placed it in an evidence bag, where it would join the mounting case against one of the country's most powerful pharmaceutical companies, a case built on the foundation of one chemist's integrity and one boy's simple act of kindness with a blue-plaid blanket. When the agents returned to their monitoring station, they found a new development on the secure communication channel. One of them frowned, reading the message aloud. "They corrupted someone on the police force. We have a traitor among us." Ethan sat in the living room of the safe house, turning the recovered USB drive over in his hands, while James Thompson settled into an armchair across from him. The older man's face was lined with fatigue, but his eyes remained sharp and observant. "That enigmatic comment about something hidden in the most obvious place," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "What did you mean?" James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Your father was methodical, brilliant at hiding things in plain sight. When William told me what David had accomplished, I knew we had to find you before the Collins people did." Jessica entered from the kitchen, carrying 3 mugs of tea. "I still can't process all this. 2 days ago, we were facing eviction and a child services investigation. Now we're in protective custody because my husband uncovered corporate fraud." "Not just fraud," James corrected, accepting the steaming mug. "Criminal negligence resulting in multiple deaths, manufacturing shortcuts that rendered medications dangerous while falsifying safety data." Ethan stared into his tea. "Dad never mentioned any of this." "He couldn't," Jessica said softly, sitting beside her son. "He was trying to protect us." The next morning, federal agents drove them to the small storage unit where they'd placed David's personal effects after his death. The padlock was intact, but Ethan noticed subtle signs that someone had attempted to force it open. "They've been here too," James observed, running his finger along a fresh scratch in the metal door. Inside, cardboard boxes were stacked against the back wall, David's clothes, books, and personal items that had been too painful for Jessica to keep in the apartment, but too precious to discard. "I haven't been here in months," Jessica admitted, her voice echoing in the confined space. Ethan moved directly to a box labeled Lab Notes and Books. Something in his father's final message had triggered a memory, something about hiding information in the place most obvious. His father's professional books would be the natural place for a chemist to hide chemistry-related evidence. As they sifted through the storage unit, Agent Patel arrived with a tablet displaying the morning news. Headlines about the Collins arrests dominated every major outlet, though most referred only vaguely to allegations of corporate malfeasance and anonymous whistleblower information. "They're controlling the narrative," Agent Patel explained. "Collins Enterprises has a crisis management team working around the clock to minimize damage. They're calling it a regulatory misunderstanding." Jessica scoffed. "People died because of their misunderstanding." "Which is why we need your husband's complete evidence," Agent Patel replied. "What we have is compelling but fragmentary. If David compiled everything as thoroughly as we believe, it could completely dismantle their defense." A federal agent appeared at the doorway. "Mrs. Miller, there's an investigative reporter asking for a statement. Says he has information that might help your case." "Tell him no comment," Jessica replied automatically. "Actually," James interjected, "it might be worth hearing what he knows. Carefully, of course." As Jessica stepped out with James and Agent Patel to speak with the reporter, Ethan continued examining his father's books. He pulled out a heavy organic chemistry textbook, remembering how his father would sometimes reference specific pages when explaining concepts to him. That night, Ethan dreamed of his father in vivid detail. In the dream, David stood in his home laboratory, pointing insistently at something on his workbench. The item seemed both important and familiar, but Ethan couldn't quite identify it. He woke with a jolt, the image fading but leaving behind a sense of urgency. At breakfast, he described the dream to his mother. "Your father's workbench," Jessica repeated thoughtfully. "His actual laboratory equipment is still in storage at biotech. I never had clearance to claim it." "We need to see it," Ethan insisted. Jessica made a phone call to Dr. Ramirez, one of David's former colleagues who had reached out after seeing the news. After a brief conversation, she hung up with a mixture of hope and concern. "He can get us in today, but almost everything has been cleared out. Standard procedure when an employee leaves or dies." "They didn't just clear it out," James said grimly. "They'd have scrubbed it clean of evidence." But Ethan wasn't deterred. Dad would have known they'd do that. That's why he hid things elsewhere. At school, Ethan noticed the changed atmosphere immediately. Teachers gave him curious looks, and conversations stopped when he walked by. In his locker, he found a folded piece of paper that sent a chill down his spine. "Your father should have stayed quiet. You should do the same." He showed the note to Agent Patel, who was posing as a substitute teacher to maintain surveillance. "We'll analyze it for fingerprints," she promised. "But this suggests there may still be Collins sympathizers in the school." During history class, Ethan found himself unable to concentrate. The teacher was discussing the Watergate scandal, and something about the lesson triggered a memory, his father teaching him about hidden messages. When he was 8, David had created an elaborate treasure hunt for Ethan's birthday. Each clue was hidden in the margins of different books on their shelves, written in a simple substitution cipher they had developed together. "That's it," Ethan whispered to himself, earning a sharp look from his teacher. After school, he rushed home to find Jessica examining David's life insurance documents with growing concern. "These numbers don't add up," she murmured. "The accident report states his car was traveling at 65 miles per hour when it veered off the road, but the insurance investigator's report says the impact damage was consistent with a much higher speed." "They tampered with the evidence," Ethan said, not surprised. "Mom, I think Dad left us messages in his books. Remember those codes we used to make?" Jessica's eyes widened. "The margin notes. I always thought they were just his research thoughts." They gathered every book from David's collection, spreading them across the safe house living room floor. James watched with interest as they flipped through pages, scanning for anything unusual in the margins. "Here!" Ethan exclaimed after an hour of searching. In a dog-eared copy of Advanced Organic Synthesis, tiny, nearly microscopic notes were penciled into the margins of a chapter on molecular structures. The handwriting was so small it required a magnifying glass to read properly. "It's our cipher," Jessica confirmed, examining the markings, "but more complex than the one he used for your treasure hunts." It took them the rest of the evening to decode the first page of notes. The message was clear. David had created a secure digital repository of all his evidence, accessible only through a complex authentication system. The notes contained instructions for accessing this repository and a warning that Collins would stop at nothing to prevent its discovery. "He knew," Ethan said softly. "He knew they might kill him." "And he prepared for it," James added, admiration evident in his voice. "Your father was thinking several moves ahead." As they continued decoding, the full extent of David's planning became clear. He had created multiple backups of his evidence, storing them in various locations. Some data was hidden in plain sight, embedded in innocuous-looking research papers he'd published before his death. Other evidence was encrypted and stored on servers that would automatically release the information to regulatory authorities, if not periodically reset, with a specific code. The final piece, Ethan read aloud from the decoded message, is where no one would think to look. With me, always. Jessica gasped. His grave? The evidence is buried with David? James asked incredulously. Not inside the casket, Jessica clarified, her mind racing. But somewhere at the gravesite, David and I purchased our plots together after we were married. He designed his own headstone years ago, said it was practical planning. He created a hiding place in his own memorial, Ethan realized, the brilliance of it dawning on him. Somewhere on or in the headstone itself. The next morning, plans were made to visit the cemetery under federal protection. As they prepared to leave, Jessica received a phone call from an unknown number. Mrs. Miller, a smooth, unfamiliar voice began. This is Harold Brennan, Chief Legal Officer at Collins Enterprises. I'm calling with a proposition that could resolve our unfortunate situation to everyone's satisfaction. Jessica put the call on speaker, motioning for James to listen. We're prepared to assume all medical debts related to your husband's treatment, plus provide a generous settlement. Let's say $5 million. In exchange, we simply ask for your discretion regarding certain unverified allegations. You mean you'll pay us to stay quiet about how your company killed my husband and covered it up? Jessica replied, her voice ice cold. There was a pause. Mrs. Miller, these unfortunate conspiracy theories are exactly what we hope to put behind us. Your husband's accident was tragic, but attempting to link it to Collins will only result in prolonged litigation where everyone loses. Think of your son's future. I am thinking of my son's future, Jessica replied, and the future of every person who might take your compromised medications. Goodbye, Mr. Brennan. As she hung up, Ethan looked at his mother with newfound admiration. The Jessica Miller from just days ago might have considered such an offer out of desperation. This Jessica Miller stood straighter, embodying the same determination that had driven his father. They're scared, James observed. That offer means we're close to something big. Ethan nodded, clutching the notebook containing their decoded messages. Dad left us a map to the truth. We just need to follow it to the end. As they prepared to depart for the cemetery, Ethan suddenly realized what his dream had been trying to tell him. The familiar object on his father's workbench hadn't been laboratory equipment at all. It was a small model of a headstone, a paperweight David had kept on his desk. When all this is over, Ethan said quietly, I want to make sure everyone knows what Dad did. Not just for us, but for all the people he was trying to protect. James placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. First, let's find what he left behind. Then we'll make sure his story is told properly. As the federal agents prepared the vehicles, Ethan carefully packed the USB drive and decoded notes. The truth about his father, the full truth, was finally coming to light. When they emerged from the safe house, Ethan noticed dark SUVs parked strategically around the block. For the first time, the sight of surveillance brought comfort rather than fear. At deciphering the annotations in the books, Ethan realized that the evidence final was hidden in the last place anyone would look for, inside his father's grave, placed there secretly during the funeral. The revelation about the evidence hidden in David's grave hung in the air like a physical presence as Ethan, Jessica, and James sat around the kitchen table in the safe house. No one spoke for several minutes, each contemplating the moral weight of the situation. We can't just dig up Dad, Ethan finally said, breaking the silence. His voice cracked slightly on the words. Jessica reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I don't think that's what your father intended. He would never put us in that position. James nodded thoughtfully. David was meticulous. If he hid something at the gravesite, it would be accessible without disturbing the grave itself. The headstone, Jessica suggested. We designed it together. He insisted on certain specifications that seemed odd at the time. She closed her eyes, trying to remember. a wider base than standard. Custom materials. Agent Patel entered the kitchen with a tablet in hand. We have options for accessing the cemetery legally. As next of kin, Mrs. Miller, you can request a site visit with minimal complications. However, she hesitated. There's a but, Jessica said flatly. Given the high-profile nature of the case now, we'd need court approval for any examination of the grave marker itself. That could take days, maybe weeks. We don't have weeks, James replied. Every day that passes gives Collins more time to destroy evidence and build their defense. The discussion continued in circles until a plan gradually emerged, one that would walk the fine line between legal and necessary. James would use his police contacts to arrange a sanctioned visit, while federal agents maintained discreet surveillance. As they finalized the details, Jessica's phone rang, an unknown number. Her finger hovered over the decline button, but something made her answer and put it on speaker. Mrs. Miller? The voice was smooth, cultured. My name is Lawrence Finch, representing Collins Enterprises Board of Directors. I understand my colleague reached out earlier with an inadequate proposal. Jessica's eyes narrowed. Mr. Finch, I have nothing to say to anyone from Collins. I completely understand your position. However, I believe my offer will interest you. There was a pause. We're prepared to eliminate all your outstanding medical debt, provide a $20 million settlement, and establish a foundation in your husband's name to investigate pharmaceutical safety. All we ask is your discretion regarding certain unsubstantiated allegations. Jessica's hand trembled slightly. $20 million. Enough to secure Ethan's future for life. Enough to never worry about money again. Mr. Finch, she replied carefully, I'll need time to consider your offer. After ending the call, Jessica covered her face with her hands. I'm sorry. The amount... It's okay, Ethan said quietly. I understand. James looked between them. They're desperate. This offer confirms we're close to something devastating for Collins. The next morning, Ethan returned to school despite Jessica's concerns. I need normal, he insisted, just for a few hours. The halls felt different now. Conversations stopped when he passed, replaced by whispers that followed in his wake. His science teacher avoided eye contact during class, while the principal made a point of asking loudly about his family situation in the crowded hallway. At lunch, Ethan sat alone until Matt Parker, a quiet boy from his math class, joined him. Is it true? Matt asked without preamble. About your dad being some kind of whistleblower? Ethan poked at his food. Where did you hear that? It's all over the internet. My dad works at Memorial Hospital. He said some medication got pulled yesterday because of what your dad discovered. Before Ethan could respond, he noticed a group of 8th graders watching him intently from across the cafeteria. One of them, Jason Collins, was the nephew of a Collins Enterprises executive. When Ethan opened his locker after lunch, another note fluttered to the floor. Some secrets should stay buried, like your dad. Agent Patel, still undercover as a substitute, collected the note with gloved hands when Ethan reported it. We'll add it to the evidence, she said grimly, and increase security around you. That evening, in the quiet of the safe house, Ethan found himself drawn to his father's books again. Specifically, a dog-eared copy of Principles of Ethical Science that had been David's constant companion during his university years. As he flipped through it, Ethan recalled the codes they had created together, simple substitution ciphers that had evolved over the years into their private language. His father had turned lessons into games, teaching Ethan about encryption and hidden messages through elaborate treasure hunts. On your 8th birthday, Ethan murmured to himself, remembering, the big treasure hunt. For Ethan's 8th birthday, David had created a complex series of clues hidden throughout their home and neighborhood. Each clue was written in their secret code, with directions to the next location. The final prize had been a chemistry set that they spent the entire summer exploring together. That particular memory triggered something else, a conversation they'd had while mixing harmless chemicals in the backyard. "Sometimes, Ethan," his father had said, "the most important things need to be hidden in plain sight, where only the right person will think to look." With sudden clarity, Ethan realized his father had been preparing him all along, teaching him skills he would need when the time came. The ciphers, the hiding places, the lessons about standing up for truth, all of it had been groundwork for this moment. Late that night, Jessica received a call from Dr. Ramirez, David's former colleague. "I can get you in tomorrow morning," he said, his voice hushed. "Security has been increased, but I still have access to the storage area. Be at the service entrance at 7 a.m. At Biotech Formulations the next day, Dr. Ramirez led them through back corridors to a basement storage room filled with labeled equipment. David's workstation was cleared immediately after his death, Ramirez explained, unlocking a storage cage. Standard procedure, they claimed, but they were unusually thorough. They even reformatted his computer before I could access it. They knew what he had discovered, James observed. "Yes, but David was smarter," Ramirez replied, pulling out a dusty box labeled Miller, Personal Effects. He never kept the important data on company servers, and he had a particular distrust of digital storage for sensitive information. Inside the box were seemingly innocuous items: a coffee mug, family photos for his desk, and several journals with handwritten notes that appeared to be standard research observations. Jessica picked up one of the journals, flipping through pages of chemical formulas and observations. "These look like normal lab notes." "They're anything but normal," Ramirez said quietly. "Look at the margins." Using a magnifying glass, they discovered the same microscopic writing they'd found in David's books. More code, more evidence, hidden in plain sight in notebooks that had been overlooked during the purge of his workstation. "He left breadcrumbs everywhere," James said, admiration evident in his voice. "David suspected they were monitoring him toward the end," Ramirez confirmed. "He told me to watch for patterns in the trial results. When I started noticing discrepancies, they transferred me to another department." As they packed up the journals, Jessica's phone rang. The school. "Mrs. Miller, this is Principal Whitman. There's been an incident involving Ethan. Nothing to worry about," he added quickly, "but I need you to come to the school as soon as possible." At Lincoln Elementary, they found Ethan in the principal's office with a split lip. Across from him sat Jason Collins, sporting the beginnings of an impressive black eye. "Mrs. Miller," Principal Whitman began, "I understand your family is going through a difficult time, but violence is never acceptable at our school. He said my dad was a liar who killed himself because he couldn't face what he'd done," Ethan stated flatly, staring at the floor. "He said Collins Enterprises would make sure we ended up homeless." Jessica's face hardened. "And where did Jason hear these things, I wonder?" Jason's father, a thin man in an expensive suit, shifted uncomfortably. "Children repeat things without understanding context. I'm sure Jason meant no harm." "Like your company meant no harm when they falsified safety data," Jessica replied evenly. "Or when they covered up my husband's murder." The principal blanched. "Mrs. Miller, these are serious allegations, which will be thoroughly explored in court," James interrupted, flashing his former detective's badge. "Meanwhile, I suggest Mr. Collins consider the legal implications of witness intimidation through a minor." That evening, as they processed the day's events, Jessica made a decision. "We're going to the cemetery tomorrow. I don't care what legal hurdles exist. David left something there, and we need to find it." "The Collins people will be watching the cemetery," James warned. "Let them watch," Jessica replied. "We've done nothing wrong." Later, as Ethan prepared for bed, James joined him in the small bedroom of the safe house. "Your father was an extraordinary man," the former detective said quietly. William admired him greatly, even in their brief acquaintance. He said David was thinking 3 steps ahead of everyone else. "I just want to understand why," Ethan replied. "Why he risked everything. Why he didn't just take their money and keep quiet." James considered this. "Some people can't live with lies, Ethan. They see a wrong and must make it right, no matter the cost." He stood to leave, then turned back. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be challenging." As darkness filled the room, Ethan stared at the ceiling, thinking about his father's grave. What could be hidden there, and was it worth the risk to find out? In the pre-dawn hours, he was awakened by urgent voices. James and Agent Patel stood in the living room with Jessica, who looked pale. "We have reliable intelligence that Collins has compromised at least 2 officers in the local precinct," Agent Patel was saying. "They're planning to intercept us at the cemetery with a fraudulent warrant." "How do we counter that?" Jessica asked. "We need to move first," James replied grimly. "Tonight, before they expect us. I have former colleagues who can ensure we have legitimate access." "What about Ethan?" Jessica glanced toward his bedroom. "It's too dangerous." James shook his head. "The code was meant for him. David's clues were designed for his son's understanding. We need him." As they huddled around the kitchen table, planning their nighttime expedition, headlights swept across the window. Everyone froze. A moment later, they heard car doors slamming and footsteps approaching. "Federal agents," a voice called through the door. "We have a warrant." "Our people wouldn't announce themselves that way," Agent Patel whispered, drawing her weapon. James gestured for Ethan and Jessica to move toward the back bedroom. "Use the emergency exit we showed you. I'll delay them." As they slipped toward the rear of the safe house, Ethan clutched the decoded notebooks against his chest. Through the window, he could see flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as more men surrounded the building. While they hid between the headstones, Ethan held the recovered evidence tightly against his chest, and James urgently whispered, "They corrupted someone on the police force. We have a traitor among us." Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs as he crouched between 2 weathered grave markers, his father's evidence clutched tightly against his chest. The cemetery stretched before them in eerie silence, moonlight casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. Jessica knelt beside him, her breathing shallow and controlled, while James peered carefully around a large marble angel, tracking the movements of Collins' men with practiced vigilance. "They're moving systematically through the northern section," James whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle rustle of leaves. 4 men with flashlights, moving in a search pattern. Ethan watched the beams of light sweep methodically across the cemetery grounds. Each flash illuminated a different grave marker, before continuing its relentless journey. The men moved with purpose, checking behind larger monuments and mausoleums. "They know exactly what they're looking for," Jessica murmured. "How could they possibly know we'd be here tonight?" James's expression darkened. "Someone leaked our plans. Someone close to the investigation." "But who?" Ethan asked, trying to keep his voice steady despite his fear. "Questions for later," James replied tersely. "Right now, we need to move. Stay low and follow me." He led them through a winding path between headstones, choosing a route that kept them hidden from the searching flashlights. Years of detective work had taught James how to move unseen, and he applied those skills now with practiced efficiency. Ethan focused on placing his feet exactly where James did, avoiding twigs or loose gravel that might betray their position. After what felt like an eternity of tense, careful movement, they reached the cemetery's eastern perimeter. An old maintenance path ran behind a row of yew trees, providing cover from the main grounds. "There's a service gate near the groundskeeper's shed," James explained, pointing toward a small building barely visible in the darkness. It's rarely used and usually unlocked. They made their way toward the gate, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter behind them. Just as they reached the fence, Ethan heard a harsh voice call out from somewhere in the cemetery, "Check the northeastern corner again. The grave is in Section D." "They know exactly where Dad is buried," Ethan whispered, a chill running down his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. James worked quickly at the old gate, manipulating the rusty latch until it gave way with a reluctant creak. They slipped through the opening and found themselves on a narrow dirt path that led into a small wooded area behind the cemetery. "This way," James directed, leading them deeper into the trees. "I have a car parked on the service road about a quarter-mile from here." They moved as quickly as they dared through the underbrush, the sounds of the search party now completely faded behind them. When they finally emerged onto a narrow gravel road, James produced a set of keys from his pocket. An old sedan sat waiting, deliberately nondescript. "Get in," he instructed, unlocking the doors. "We need to regroup and figure out our next move." As they drove away from the cemetery, Jessica turned to James. "What happens now? They'll be watching the grave constantly after this." "We need a new plan," James acknowledged, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "And we need to figure out who our traitor is." They drove in tense silence to a small apartment complex on the outskirts of town. James parked in an underground garage and led them to a unit on the 3rd floor. "My brother kept several safe locations around the city," he explained as he unlocked the door. "This one isn't connected to either of us officially." The apartment was small but functional, sparsely furnished with the basics. James immediately went to a desk crowded with outdated surveillance equipment and began making calls on a secure line. Jessica guided Ethan to the kitchen table, where they spread out the documents and evidence they'd managed to preserve. "How did they know we were coming?" Ethan asked, the question that had been nagging at him since their escape. "Someone on the inside," Jessica replied grimly. "Someone who knew our plans." James returned from his calls, his expression grave. "I've spoken with contacts I trust absolutely. The corruption goes deeper than we thought. At least 3 officers in the local precinct are on Collins' payroll, plus someone in the federal task force." "Agent Patel?" Jessica asked. James shook his head. "I don't think so. She was being monitored too, according to my sources. Her communications were compromised." On the small television in the corner, a news broadcast caught their attention. The anchor was reporting on what they described as regulatory issues at Collins Enterprises, carefully avoiding any suggestion of criminal wrongdoing. A company spokesperson dismissed the allegations as misunderstandings that would be quickly resolved. "They're controlling the narrative," Jessica observed bitterly. "Not for long," James replied, gesturing to the evidence spread across the table. "Let's see what we have that can change that." While Jessica and James examined the USB drive's contents on a secure laptop, Ethan noticed that his mother's cell phone was lighting up with notifications. When she checked it, her face paled. "Someone's installed tracking software on my phone," she whispered, showing them the unfamiliar app that had somehow been downloaded. "They could have been monitoring our location this whole time." James immediately took the phone, removed the battery, and placed it in a metal container. "We'll need to assume all our previous devices are compromised. From now on, we use only the secure equipment here." As the night progressed, they worked systematically through the evidence David had compiled. The USB drive contained damning information about Collins's manufacturing practices, internal memos acknowledging contamination issues, emails discussing ways to conceal adverse reactions, and financial projections showing the immense profits at stake. "Dad recorded everything," Ethan said with quiet pride, watching as document after document revealed the truth his father had died to protect. Jessica found a hidden folder containing clinical trial data that had been altered before submission to regulatory agencies. This proves they knew about the cardiac side effects months before approval. They deliberately concealed deaths during the trials. While they worked, James formulated a plan. We need to get this directly to the federal prosecutor. No intermediaries, no one who might be compromised. How? Jessica asked. They'll be watching every official channel. I still have contacts from my days on the force, people whose integrity is beyond question. We'll establish a direct line to the prosecutor's office. As dawn approached, they took a short break. Jessica made coffee while Ethan stretched his cramped limbs. The weight of their situation hung heavy in the air, but for the first time since the ordeal began, Ethan felt a glimmer of hope. His father's meticulous work would not be in vain. While browsing through a folder of personal files on the USB drive, Ethan discovered something unexpected. A video file labeled simply, "For Ethan." With trembling fingers, he clicked play. His father's face filled the screen, and Ethan felt his breath catch. David looked tired, worried, but resolute. "Ethan," he began, his voice steady despite the concern in his eyes. "If you're watching this, then things have gone as I feared they might. I want you to know that everything I've done to protect people who couldn't protect themselves." He paused, swallowing hard. "Including you and your mother." Ethan called Jessica over, and they watched together as David explained his discovery of the medication dangers, his attempts to address them internally, and the increasing threats as he prepared to go public. "I've made arrangements," David continued, "to ensure the truth comes out, even if something happens to me. I chose the path of truth, knowing the risks, because some principles are worth standing for, no matter the cost." His expression softened. "I love you both more than anything. Never forget that." As the video ended, Jessica wiped tears from her cheeks. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew what might happen." "And he still chose to do the right thing," Ethan said, a new resolve hardening within him. James received an alert from one of his contacts. Collins was offering a substantial reward for information about the Miller family's whereabouts. "They're getting desperate," he observed. "That's good for us. Desperate people make mistakes." After careful consideration, they made a difficult decision. They would split up. James would take one copy of the evidence and attempt to reach the federal prosecutor through his most trusted contact. Jessica and Ethan would take another route with a backup copy, making their way to a journalist James trusted, someone with a history of protecting sources and exposing corporate wrongdoing. "Dividing their focus gives us a better chance of getting the truth out," James explained. "If they catch one of us, the other team can still complete the mission." As they prepared to separate, James handed Jessica a secure phone. "Use this only for the arranged check-in times. No other communications." Ethan carefully packed the backup evidence into a nondescript backpack, including the USB drive, and selected hard copies of the most damning documents. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders, his father's legacy, quite literally, in his hands. Just as they were finalizing the details of their separation, a piercing sound of sirens approaching made all three freeze in place. Through the apartment window, they could see the street below being surrounded by police vehicles, lights flashing in the gray dawn. "How did they find us?" Jessica whispered, panic edging into her voice. James moved quickly to the window, careful to stay hidden from view. "That's not Collins' people," he said with cautious surprise. "Those are federal agents, but I can't tell if they're allies or threats." When they're about to separate, a sound as strident of sirens approaching makes the trio freeze, and through the window, they see the building being surrounded by police officers, but it's impossible to determine if they are allies or threats. The sirens grew louder as James motioned for Jessica and Ethan to move away from the windows. The flashing blue lights bathed the apartment walls in rhythmic pulses. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he clutched the backpack containing his father's evidence. "Down the back stairs," James whispered, guiding them toward a narrow doorway. "There's a service exit that—" A sharp knock on the door interrupted him. Federal agents, open the door. James signaled for them to remain still as he peered through the peephole. His tense shoulders relaxed slightly. It's Agent Chen, he murmured with cautious relief. Rebecca Chen. She worked with William on previous cases. Can we trust her? Jessica asked, her voice barely audible. William did, James replied, his hand hovering over the doorknob. And right now, we don't have many options. With a decisive motion, he opened the door to reveal a stern-faced Asian American woman in a tailored suit, flanked by 4 agents in tactical gear. James Thompson, she said, stepping forward authoritatively. We need to secure you and the Millers immediately. How did you find us? James demanded, not moving from the doorway. William's protocols, Agent Chen replied. When his secure server detected his medical records being accessed after his reported transfer, it triggered an alert. We've been tracking Collins' people tracking you. She glanced at her watch. We don't have time for a full explanation. There's a compromised local police unit 3 minutes behind us, with orders to detain you on falsified charges. Something in her direct manner convinced James. He stepped aside, allowing Chen and her team to enter. Mrs. Miller, Ethan, Chen nodded to them. I'm Federal Prosecutor Rebecca Chen. I've been working with William Thompson on building a case against Collins Enterprises for the past 6 months. Why haven't we heard about you before now? Jessica asked suspiciously. Because William was careful, Chen answered, as her agents quickly swept the apartment for surveillance devices. He compartmentalized everything after the first attempt on his life. First attempt? Ethan echoed. Chen's expression softened slightly as she regarded the boy. Your father wasn't Collins's first victim, Ethan, just their most significant one. One of Chen's agents approached her. Vehicle secured in the back, ma'am. We need to move now. Within minutes, they were being escorted down a service elevator to an unmarked van. As they pulled away, 2 police cruisers screeched into the complex entrance, officers rushing out with weapons drawn. That was close, Jessica murmured, holding Ethan's hand tightly. Too close, Chen agreed from the front passenger seat. We have a safe location prepared. The division within law enforcement is significant. Some officers have been compromised by Collins' money. Others are determined to bring them down. The van wound through side streets, taking an elaborate route to avoid surveillance. Eventually, they arrived at an unassuming office building on the outskirts of the city. Inside, Chen led them to a conference room that had been converted into an operations center, with computers, communication equipment, and evidence boards covering the walls. Welcome to our command center, Chen said, gesturing around the room. It's not much, but it's secure and off Collins' radar. As Ethan looked around, he noticed photos of his father pinned to one of the boards. Newspaper clippings, chemical formulas, and timeline charts surrounded the image. His father's work hadn't been forgotten. It had been the foundation for something larger. We've been building this case for months, Chen explained, noticing Ethan's attention to the board. When William first approached me with David's initial findings, I was skeptical. But the evidence was compelling, and as we dug deeper, the corruption we uncovered was staggering. On a large television screen in the corner, a Collins Enterprises press conference was being broadcast. The CEO, flanked by lawyers, was making a statement. These unfounded allegations represent a misunderstanding of standard industry practices. Collins Enterprises has always prioritized patient safety, and we are cooperating fully with regulatory inquiries into these spurious claims. They're good at spinning, Chen observed bitterly. Their crisis management team has been working overtime to control the narrative. James placed the evidence they'd gathered on the conference table. This might change that narrative. Chen's team immediately began processing the new material, authenticating documents and organizing them into the existing case structure. As they worked, Chen explained the complicated legal landscape they were navigating. Collins has dozens of high-profile attorneys on retainer. They've already filed motions to suppress evidence, claiming corporate espionage and theft of proprietary information. Her expression hardened. They're trying to paint David as a disgruntled employee who stole company secrets. That's a lie, Ethan protested. We know that, Chen assured him, but courts move slowly, and Collins is using every legal maneuver to buy time while they destroy evidence and silence witnesses. Jessica's phone rang unexpectedly, the secure one James had given her. She answered hesitantly, then her expression brightened. Dr. Ramirez? Yes, this is Jessica Miller. She listened intently before addressing the room. David's former colleague wants to testify. He says other scientists from the lab are ready to come forward too. This news energized Chen's team. Witness testimony will be crucial, one of the legal analysts explained. Documents can be challenged as forgeries, but first-hand accounts from multiple witnesses are much harder to discredit. While the adults coordinated with potential witnesses, Ethan found himself drawn to a computer station where a young agent was searching through online forums. What are you looking for? Ethan asked. The agent, barely in his 20s, glanced up. Patient reports. People who've experienced side effects consistent with the contamination your father discovered. He pointed to the screen. There are entire communities online discussing symptoms that the company claims are statistically insignificant. Ethan leaned closer, reading the desperate posts from people describing symptoms exactly matching what his father had documented. An idea formed in his mind. Can I help? He asked. I understand my dad's research and I know what symptoms to look for. The young agent looked to Chen for approval, who nodded after a moment's consideration. For the next hour, Ethan helped identify relevant patient accounts, creating a database of potential witnesses who could testify to the medication's harmful effects. Meanwhile, James and Jessica reviewed financial documents with Chen's forensic accountants, uncovering a trail of suspicious payments to regulatory officials who had overseen Collins's drug approvals. This is bribery, plain and simple, Jessica said, pointing to a pattern of offshore transactions. Clever bribery, the accountant corrected. Disguised as consulting fees and speaking engagements. Legal on paper, but the pattern is damning when you see it all together. As the day progressed, more scientists from biotech formulations contacted Dr. Ramirez, expressing willingness to testify. Former employees who had been silenced through non-disclosure agreements and threatened with litigation were finding courage in numbers. It's happening, James said quietly to Jessica. The wall of silence is cracking. By evening, Chen's team had assembled a preliminary case file integrating the new evidence. The atmosphere in the command center had shifted from tense to cautiously optimistic. We have enough to request a formal grand jury investigation, Chen announced, not just into the medication contamination, but into David Miller's death as well. As the team prepared the necessary filings, Ethan approached Chen with his laptop. I've connected with 53 patients who experienced the cardiac symptoms Dad documented. They're all willing to speak with your team. Chen looked impressed. That's excellent work, Ethan. These testimonies will help illustrate the human cost of Collins' corruption. A commotion at the door interrupted their conversation as a group of scientists was escorted into the command center, Dr. Ramirez leading the way. Sorry for the dramatic entrance, Ramirez apologized. Collins' security was watching our homes. Your agents had to extract us rather creatively. 7 of David's former colleagues, Chen explained to Jessica and Ethan, each with first-hand knowledge of the data manipulation. The reunion was emotional, with the scientists expressing remorse for not supporting David more openly before his death. We were afraid, one admitted tearfully to Jessica, but seeing what you and your son are doing now, standing up to them despite everything, we couldn't stay silent anymore. As the team worked late into the night, Ethan observed the growing network of people coming together to vindicate his father. The patient advocates he'd connected with online were now coordinating with legal volunteers. Scientists were explaining complex chemical processes to prosecutors preparing indictments. Former regulatory employees were identifying which officials had been compromised. Around midnight, as Ethan was beginning to doze in his chair, Jessica covered him with her jacket. "You should get some rest," she said softly. "I want to help," he murmured sleepily. "You already have," she assured him. "More than you know." Just as Ethan was about to give in to exhaustion, Rebecca's phone rang. Her expression grew increasingly grave as she listened. When she hung up, the room fell silent. "Collins is making a major move," she announced. "They've filed for an emergency injunction to seize all evidence in our possession, claiming it constitutes stolen intellectual property." She checked her watch. "The hearing is scheduled for 8 a.m. tomorrow before Judge Harmon." "Harmon?" James asked sharply. "He has ties to Collins's board of directors." "Exactly," Chen confirmed grimly. "They're calling in every favor they have. If this injunction is granted, we lose access to all the evidence until ownership can be determined, which could take months or years." Jessica squeezed Ethan's hand. "What can we do?" "We have 8 hours to prepare our counter-arguments," Chen replied, determination hardening her voice. 8 hours to build a case strong enough that even a friendly judge can't rule against us." As the legal team mobilized with renewed urgency, Ethan fought to stay awake. His father had spent months documenting the truth, working late into the night, just like these people were doing now. The least he could do was witness their efforts. Rebecca hung up the phone with a grave expression and announced, "They obtained an emergency judicial order to seize all our evidence tomorrow at dawn. We have only 8 hours to build a bulletproof case, or everything will be lost." James's apartment had transformed into a crisis center, digital clocks on laptops and phones displaying the relentless countdown to dawn. The air felt electric with tension as Chen's team worked frantically to organize and authenticate every piece of evidence before the court order took effect. Ethan, despite his exhaustion, found himself at the center of the activity. His unique perspective on his father's coding system and organizational patterns proved invaluable as the team sorted through the mountain of evidence. Dad always arranged his research notes chronologically, but with cross-references by subject, Ethan explained to a forensic accountant who was struggling to connect a series of financial transactions. "Try looking for margin notes with asterisks." That was his system for flagging related entries. The accountant followed Ethan's suggestion and exclaimed, "There it is. The connection between the altered test results and the offshore payments. The timestamps match perfectly." Rebecca Chen observed Ethan's contributions with quiet amazement. "Your father would be proud," she said during a brief coffee break. "You're seeing connections that even trained investigators missed." Ethan smiled tiredly. "Dad used to say I had a knack for puzzles. We spent hours creating and solving them together." His expression grew solemn. "I think he was training me without me knowing it." Across the room, Jessica was working with Dr. Ramirez to authenticate a series of lab reports that proved Collins had known about the cardiac side effects months before the medication received approval. The official reports submitted to regulators show 0 cardiac incidents, Dr. Ramirez explained, pointing to a document on the left. But these internal memos acknowledge 17 cases during the same trial period. "How could they possibly think they'd get away with this?" Jessica asked, her voice tight with anger. "They almost did," Dr. Ramirez replied grimly. "Without David's meticulous documentation, these connections would have remained buried in bureaucratic paperwork forever." A forensic technology specialist approached Rebecca with a tablet. "We've completed the authentication process for the digital evidence. We've established an unbroken chain of custody and verified the metadata signatures. Collins can't claim these files were tampered with." "Good," Rebecca nodded. "Make sure everything is duplicated and backed up to the secure servers. I want redundancy in case they try to claim physical evidence was mishandled." In a corner of the room, a video conference was ongoing with a judge who had been awakened at home. Rebecca's deputy was arguing passionately for a protective order on the most crucial evidence, citing public safety concerns that superseded intellectual property claims. The night wore on, the countdown clock showing fewer and fewer hours until the Collins lawyers would arrive with their court order. Ethan found himself organizing a particularly complex set of chemical formulas that showed how the medication had been altered to reduce production costs. "These molecular structures," he said, pointing to a diagram. Dad highlighted them specifically in his notes. "The substitution seems minor, but according to his calculations, it creates a compound that can cause arterial inflammation when it breaks down in the bloodstream." A pharmaceutical expert on Chen's team looked impressed. "Your understanding of chemistry is impressive for your age." "Dad taught me," Ethan said simply. He believed in explaining things properly, not talking down to kids. Around 3 a.m., Jessica discovered more personal videos from David hidden among the files, intimate family moments interspersed with evidence footage. It was a brilliant strategy for concealment, but also heartbreaking to watch. "He recorded himself at my piano recital last year," Ethan observed, watching over his mother's shoulder as the video played. "But look at the background. See the whiteboard in the school hallway? It shows the schedule for a medication trial that wasn't included in the official reports." "He was documenting everything, everywhere," Jessica whispered. "Even at your school events." James coordinated with a network of trusted police officers, ensuring that witnesses receiving threats had protection. "Collins is getting desperate," he reported. "They've been sending intimidation teams to the homes of former employees who've agreed to testify." A forensic technician completed the authentication certificates for each piece of digital evidence, creating an ironclad chain of custody documentation. "This makes it nearly impossible for them to claim the evidence was tampered with," she explained. "Every file has been hashed and time-stamped." At 4:30 a.m., Rebecca received word that a federal judge had granted limited protection for the most critical evidence. "It's not everything we wanted," she explained to the team, "but it prevents Collins from seizing the documentation of intentional data falsification and the evidence related to David's death." The legal strategy came together like a complex puzzle. Distributing authenticated copies to multiple agencies simultaneously would create a bureaucratic nightmare for Collins. Even if they succeeded in suppressing evidence in one jurisdiction, others would still have access. As dawn approached, exhaustion weighed heavily on everyone, but determination kept them working. Ethan, fighting to keep his eyes open, found himself organizing a final batch of patient testimonies, stories of people whose lives had been destroyed by the very medication that was supposed to help them. At 6:45 a.m., Rebecca gathered everyone in the center of the room. "Collins' attorneys will be here with their court order in just over an hour. Here's where we stand. We've authenticated and secured the most damning evidence. Multiple agencies now have copies of the core documentation. We've established a witness protection protocol for the scientists and former employees who've come forward." She looked around the room, making eye contact with each person. "This isn't just about winning a legal battle. This is about justice for David Miller and every patient harmed by Collins' greed. No matter what happens when those lawyers walk through that door, the truth is already out there, spreading through the system. They can't stop it now." Ethan felt a surge of pride at her words. His father's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. At 7:15 a.m., a Collins Enterprises lawyer called Rebecca directly. The call was put on speaker. "Federal Prosecutor Chen," the smooth voice began, "this is Harold Brennan, Chief Legal Officer for Collins. I wanted to speak with you before things become unnecessarily adversarial this morning." "I'm listening, Mr. Brennan," Rebecca replied coolly. "We've reviewed the situation and are prepared to offer a settlement that would benefit all parties. For the Miller family, full compensation for all alleged damages, plus a substantial good faith payment, let's say $50 million. For your office, Collins will agree to enhanced compliance monitoring and significant financial penalties without admission of wrongdoing." The room fell silent. $50 million. An amount so large it was difficult to comprehend. Ethan watched his mother's face, seeing the brief flicker of temptation cross her features. "And in exchange?" Rebecca asked, her voice steady. "All evidence collected would be sealed under the settlement agreement. The Miller family would sign a standard non-disclosure agreement. Your office would issue a statement acknowledging that regulatory lapses were identified and addressed cooperatively." Jessica looked at Ethan, a silent question in her eyes. $50 million would secure his future beyond any worry. They could move anywhere, do anything. The temptation was palpable. Ethan thought about what his father would do, what he had done, when faced with a similar choice. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the settlement proposal that had been faxed over and tore it in half. "My dad wanted to save lives," he said quietly, "not make money." Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant with pride. She turned to the speakerphone. "Mr. Brennan, we're not interested in your offer. My husband died to expose the truth, and we intend to honor his sacrifice. Mrs. Miller, please consider carefully." Brennan's voice took on an edge of desperation. "This offer won't remain on the table once legal proceedings advance." "Then it appears we have nothing further to discuss," Rebecca interjected smoothly. "We'll see your team at 8 o'clock, Mr. Brennan." As she ended the call, the room erupted in quiet applause. The legal team returned to their preparations with renewed vigor, inspired by the family's integrity. At 7:45 a.m., security alerted them that multiple vehicles were arriving, expensive black cars disgorging men and women in immaculate suits, accompanied by uniformed officers carrying the court order. "They're bringing a small army," James observed from the window. "Let them," Rebecca replied, gathering her documents. "We're ready." The team took their positions. The evidence was secured, authenticated, and distributed. The witnesses were protected. The legal counter-arguments were prepared. At precisely 8:00 a.m., the elevator dinged, and footsteps approached down the hallway. Rebecca straightened her jacket and moved to the door. Ethan and Jessica stood together, hand in hand, as the door opened, to reveal a wall of stern-faced lawyers led by Harold Brennan himself. "Federal Prosecutor Chen," Brennan began formally, "we have a court order requiring the immediate surrender of all materials related to Collins Enterprises' proprietary information." Rebecca accepted the document with a calm smile, reviewing it thoroughly before responding. "Of course, Mr. Brennan, we are prepared to comply with all legally valid aspects of this order." Brennan's confident expression faltered slightly at her composed reaction. He had clearly expected resistance or panic. As the lawyers began to advance into the room, Rebecca's phone rang. She checked the display and held up one finger. "Excuse me a moment. This is important." The Collins lawyers watched impatiently as she took the call, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to unmistakable satisfaction. "Thank you, sir. We'll proceed accordingly." She hung up and addressed the room with a barely contained smile. "That was the Attorney General's office. The Department of Justice has just opened a formal federal investigation into Collins Enterprises based on evidence provided by our team." She turned to Brennan. "The Attorney General has specifically instructed that all evidence related to David Miller's findings is to be preserved under federal protection." Brennan's face drained of color as Rebecca continued. "It appears, Mr. Brennan, that David Miller's story has finally reached the right people." A montage of newspaper headlines flashed across the television screen in Ethan's living room. Collins Enterprises CEO indicted on multiple charges. Pharmaceutical giant faces criminal investigation. Whistleblower David Miller vindicated posthumously. The news anchor's voice provided commentary over the images. In what analysts are calling the most significant pharmaceutical fraud case of the decade, federal prosecutors have filed charges against 12 executives of Collins Enterprises. Ethan clicked off the television and gazed out the window of their new home. The modest house sat on a tree-lined street, far from their old apartment but close enough that he could still attend the same school when he felt ready to return. 3 weeks had passed since the dramatic confrontation in Rebecca Chen's command center, and each day had brought new developments in the case. "Ready for breakfast?" Jessica called from the kitchen, her voice lighter than it had been in months. The dark circles under her eyes had finally begun to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism that grew stronger as the case against Collins progressed. At school, Ethan found himself navigating a strange new reality. Some classmates avoided him entirely, especially those whose parents had connections to Collins Enterprises. Others treated him with a kind of reverent curiosity, as if his family's ordeal had transformed him into someone extraordinary. "Is it true your dad left secret messages for you to find?" a girl named Maya asked during lunch period. "My mom says it's like something from a spy movie." Ethan smiled politely but deflected the question. The truth of what his father had done, the courage, foresight, and sacrifice, felt too personal to share casually. He just wanted to make sure people didn't get hurt by unsafe medicine, he replied simply. After school, he found Rebecca Chen waiting outside in her government sedan. "Good afternoon, Ethan," she greeted him. "I have some documents for your mother to review. Mind if I give you a ride home?" During the drive, Rebecca updated him on the latest developments. "The formal hearing on the inheritance was completed this morning," she explained. "With the legitimacy of Richard Collins' will confirmed and William Thompson's role as executor verified, the courts have released the full inheritance to your family." Ethan looked out the window, watching familiar streets pass by. "It doesn't feel real," he admitted. "All that money. What Mom and I went through to get it." Rebecca nodded understandingly. "Your father's colleague, Dr. Ramirez, testified today. He was remarkable, clear, precise, and unwavering despite aggressive cross-examination from Collins' attorneys. He credited your father with giving him the courage to speak up." At home, Jessica sat at the dining room table, surrounded by documents. Not bills and past due notices as before, but papers related to the establishment of the David Miller Foundation for Pharmaceutical Safety. With a portion of the inheritance, she had created an organization dedicated to supporting independent drug testing and protecting future whistleblowers. "The settlement was finalized this morning," Jessica told Ethan, holding up an official-looking document with multiple signatures. "Collins Enterprises will pay restitution to all identified victims and establish a monitoring system overseen by independent scientists." The irony wasn't lost on any of them. The company that had tried to silence David Miller was now legally obligated to fund systems that would prevent similar wrongdoing in the future. It wasn't justice in its purest form. Nothing could bring back Ethan's father, but it was a vindication of everything David had stood for. That evening, Ethan visited his father's grave for the first time since their nighttime escape from the cemetery. The site was peaceful now. No Collins agents lurking behind monuments. No corrupt police waiting to intercept them. James Thompson accompanied them, maintaining a respectful distance as Ethan and Jessica approached the headstone. Ethan carried with him the blue plaid blanket, cleaned and carefully folded, that had started their extraordinary journey. Standing before his father's grave, he felt a complex mix of emotions. Grief for what he'd lost, pride in what his father had accomplished, and a strange sense of completion, as if a circle had been drawn to its close. "I think Dad would want this to be here with him," Ethan said quietly, placing the blanket gently atop the grave. It did what he needed it to do. It protected people. It revealed the truth. Jessica nodded, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "He would be so proud of you, Ethan. So proud of the courage you showed." As they stood together in the fading evening light, James approached with measured steps. "William used to say that justice comes in strange packages," he remarked, standing beside Jessica and Ethan. "Sometimes like an old blanket in the hands of a brave boy." Ethan smiled for the first time in what felt like ages, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. I guess I'll need a new blanket." "Already taken care of," Jessica replied, reaching into her bag and withdrawing a carefully wrapped package. This came with a note from William's estate. Ethan unwrapped the package to find a blue plaid blanket identical to his father's, but new and unworn. Attached was a small card with elegant handwriting. "For you to remember that the greatest warmth comes from within." The memorial service for William Thompson was held the following week, a modest affair attended primarily by former colleagues and the small circle of people who had come to know his true character. James stood stoically by the casket, his weathered face revealing little of the grief he surely felt at losing his brother. "William never wanted accolades," James told the gathered mourners. "He believed that doing the right thing was its own reward. In that way, he and David Miller were kindred spirits, men who chose integrity over comfort, truth over safety." After the service, Rebecca Chen approached Ethan and Jessica. "The Attorney General asked me to inform you that the federal case against Collins is proceeding exactly as we hoped. The evidence your father compiled was meticulous, irrefutable, even to skeptical judges." "What about the people who—" Jessica hesitated, glancing at Ethan before continuing. "Who were responsible for David's accident?" Rebecca's expression remained professional, but her eyes softened with understanding. "Two former Collins security executives have been charged with conspiracy to commit murder. The investigation is ongoing, but we expect more charges to follow." As they prepared to leave the cemetery, James joined them by the car. Once a mysterious figure known only as the school janitor, he had become a friend and steadfast ally. "I'll be staying in town for a while," he informed them. "My detective instincts don't just shut off, and there are still threads of this case I want to follow." Jessica smiled warmly. "You're always welcome in our home, James. We owe you so much." "You owe me nothing," he replied firmly. "William and I were doing what was right, just like David did." In the weeks that followed, Jessica and Ethan began the process of building a new life, one shaped by the truth they had fought to uncover, but not defined solely by tragedy. With the financial security provided by the inheritance, Jessica reduced her nursing hours to focus on establishing the foundation. Ethan returned to school with a new perspective, more confident in his own strength and more aware of the complexity of adult choices. The house they purchased was nothing extravagant. Jessica had insisted on moderation despite their newfound wealth. "Money doesn't fix everything," she had explained to Ethan, "and living simply helps us remember what's truly important." One evening, as Ethan arranged the framed photographs of his father in his new bedroom, he paused over a particular image, David teaching him to fish when he was 7, both of them laughing as Ethan struggled with the fishing rod. The photo had been among those stolen during the break-in, but later recovered from a Collins operative's hotel room during the federal investigation. "Finding a place for Dad?" Jessica asked from the doorway, watching as Ethan carefully positioned the photo on his desk. "Yeah," he replied, adjusting the frame to catch the light just right. "I want to see him every day. Remember what he stood for." The David Miller Foundation held its first formal meeting in October, with Jessica serving as director and a board comprising scientists, ethicists, and patient advocates. Their first initiative, funding independent verification of drug trial results to prevent the kind of fraud Collins had perpetrated. "This isn't just about honoring David's memory," Jessica explained to a reporter covering the foundation's launch. "It's about preventing other families from experiencing what we did. One person's courage can save countless lives." As autumn deepened into winter, the first snow of the season dusted the city. Ethan stood at his bedroom window, watching the flakes swirl in the golden glow of the street lamps. The temperature was dropping rapidly. The Weather Service had issued alerts about an approaching cold front, but inside, their home was warm and secure. Jessica knocked gently on his door, a mug of hot chocolate in her hand. "First snow," she observed, handing him the steaming drink. "Makes me think of that day at school." Ethan nodded, accepting the mug. Me too. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the snow accumulate on the lawn. So much had changed since that frigid afternoon, when Ethan had given away his father's blanket. The simple act of kindness had triggered a cascade of events that none of them could have predicted. I saw on the news that Colin's stock has dropped 60% since the indictments, Jessica commented. Their new management is implementing all the safety protocols your father recommended. Good, Ethan said simply. Later that night, wrapped in his new blue plaid blanket, Ethan thought about the message William Thompson had left for him. The greatest warmth comes from within. He understood now what those words truly meant. The warmth his father had possessed, the courage to stand up for what was right, the willingness to sacrifice for others, was something that couldn't be taken away by cold or fear or powerful enemies. As he drifted toward sleep, Ethan noticed a new student from his class walking past their house, hunched against the bitter wind, in a jacket too thin for the weather. Without hesitation, Ethan rose from his bed and moved toward the front door, a decision already forming in his mind.